Within this lesson, we're going to talk about some more interesting stuff that's available within JavaScript. So previously looked at all these different data types, and we look at how to present those and so on. So one of the really cool things is that besides having these actual values here, we can also produce pieces of code to reuse over and over again. So much like we are able to reuse these values over and over again and adjust them throughout JavaScript, there's a way to create a whole block of code and be able to reuse that and execute that whenever we want to have that value executed. And those are what's called functions. So I'm going to set up a very simple function here. I'm not going to pass anything through quite yet. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to console log out a value. So maybe I want to just log out this Apple AD or something like that. So functions don't actually get rendered out until you call the function. So all you have to do in order to call the function is do something like this. So the way that this is going to run through is that when it reads through all of these values, it's going to take into its cache that Apple AB equals strings white space, and it's going to know that whenever it calls Apple AB, it'll write this out. It'll read through this function and say, okay, well, when we hit function, my function, we're going to be able to render this out. This piece of code. It's going to run this piece of code when we're calling the function, and then over here it's going to say, okay, well, this is the calling of the function, firing of the function, and then it knows what it needs to do, what code it needs to render out. So this gets saved within the function and gets rendered out within the function. So just to show you how this is going to turn out over here, so we get that same thing here where we're actually rendering out that console log information. So along with functions, there's actually several different ways that we can write out functions. And depending on the way that you write it out, so it all actually matters how JavaScript reads through the code. And you got to keep that in mind when you are coming up with which type of function you're going to use. So I'm not going to get into too much detail about all the different ways that you can render out functions. I'm going to talk about two of the most basic ones. So this was a declaration function. And this is the most common use of functions, but there's also expression use of functions. So I could create something like my func here, and I can make it look similar to my declaration of the function, where I've got that function name, and actually I've got to place this on the other side of the equal sign. So we have to actually declare that it is a function. So somewhere along the way it has to indicate that this is a function. So my func is going to be the same thing as my function, and we're going to be able to call it within the same structure. So same thing, we have the ability to pass through arguments over here, and then whatever the function does is between the opening and closing curly brackets. So just to show you how this is going to look, and go down here, and we're going to call this one here as well. So go out and refresh it, and we see that it does the exact same thing, or it looks like it does that exact same thing, but it doesn't actually do the exact same thing, because if I was to move these before the two functions, we're going to actually get a different results here. And then this is one of those things about how JavaScript actually renders it out, that we see that my func is not a function, and it's not throwing that same error for the my function. So if I was to remove that, we're not actually going to get that same error, and it still knows how to render that out. And that's because when we use a declaration function, the way that JavaScript actually reads through the code is that it reads it all once and it places it within the cache. So over here, when it sees this, it doesn't actually take this value as understanding what's held within this function. But when we declare it within this way, it understands that my function now has been listed. It knows that there's a function attached to it. And then the second time when JavaScript runs through the code, it actually starts rendering out the code, what it hits. And when it hits my function, it knows that this is what's being held within there, as opposed to when we're writing the function expression and we don't know that there's actually a function attached to it and it doesn't know how to render that out. So order of presenting your functions is important, and calling to those functions. So we're going to talk more about functions and get into some really cool stuff as well that's available within JavaScript. Start bringing this all together to create some calculations and something dynamically happening instead of just presenting out all of this static data. And this is where we're going to present what JavaScript really has to offer. It's that dynamic capability of being able to take values, apply logic to it, make calculations, and then return those values as something unique and different that's not presented already within that code. So just working it out from the logic. So that's all coming up in the next lessons.